I'm really looking forward to talking about this particular project because it was a large project in that it involved a lot of people, and so the project brought me to meet a lot of new people and to work with a lot of new people, and so it had a lot of interesting facets to it. But as I talk through this project, one of the things I want you to please keep in mind is that this was a small part of a very large project, and it involved very, very many people. And this project, and even the small component I'm going to talk about tonight, was only made possible by a large number of people. And there are really like 4 different partners in this project. And the first partner was the Wake Forest community, and we have some members of the Wake Forest community right here today. And the Wake Forest community, most of the people living there are largely descended from the enslaved community that worked at the 19th century Kentland Plantation. And it was, this project really was taking place with their consent and their guidance and their support. And without their history and their oral history, which captures their past, this project would not have been possible. A second partner is the Kentland Revitalization Committee, and the Kentland Revitalization Committee is composed of a group of mostly Virginia Tech faculty and staff, and it's their mission to encourage a local knowledge of the history, the multicultural history of this area, and they're using Kentland to do that. And Kentland's a great property to do this kind of work because the Kentland property has archaeological sites and standing buildings which sort of represent many of the periods of our county's prehistory and history. And it was lived in by Native Americans, European Americans, African Americans. So it's a really great place for their work. The Kentland Revitalization Committee also pulled all the partners together and pushed us in a very unified, goal-directed orientation throughout this whole project. Third partner was Virginia Tech. Kentland is owned by the state, and since it is state-owned property, it is administered by Virginia Tech, and it's actually operated by the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences as the college farm. And at the college farm, it's sort of like an outdoor classroom, an outdoor laboratory, and they do experiments on crop production. And it's really with their permission and their assistance that this project took place also. And finally, the last partner was the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, and I work for the department. I'm in a regional office in Roanoke, and it's part of our mission to sort of foster and encourage an understanding of local and state history. And we do this by trying to preserve some of important archaeological sites and standing buildings, and then using those to teach about the past. And our agency is pretty small and we have limited resources, so we're really built to work in partnership with other people. So a few years back when Jimmy Price invited our office to go out to Kentland, and he took us up to this hillside up there and said, there's a slave cemetery up here. We were really intrigued. And then a few weeks later, Sam Cook formally invited us to participate in this project. We really jumped on it because we realized there was a large coalition of people already working on this, and so working together we could accomplish a lot. So I want you to please keep in mind that while we're going to be talking about a small project and looking at the archaeology, a lot of different people made this happen tonight, okay? What I want to do, first of all, is to give you a brief tour of the Kentland property, just in case you haven't been there. And we're going to take a look at some of the built environment. Those are the things on the landscape which evoke the history of the property when people visit there. We're going to take a look at that, and then I'll jump into the oral histories which led to this project that are based from the Wake Forest community, and then get into some of the archaeology. Now, the Kentland property, as we know it, really started in about 1820, and in just a couple years before that, James Randall Kent, excuse me, and Mary Cloyd Kent were married, and 2 years later they started living on this property. They actually received the 1,630-acre property as a wedding gift from her father. And this property was actually initially settled by Adam Harmon in the 1700s. and it was lived on by the Buchanan family, and it was known as Buchanan's Bottom for many, many years. And then it was occupied by the Trigg family. So the Cloyds eventually got it and then gave it to Mary Cloyd Kent and her husband, James Randall Kent. And when they first lived on this property in 1820, they were living on a house that was already there, probably built by the Triggs. And then they started planning their plantation and began planning to build their house. In about 1960 or 1987 or 1985, right around there, Virginia Tech acquired this property and an additional acreage. And they have been operating this as a college farm ever since that time. Within the college farm is one area that's the historic district, and this is the area where you will find all of the archaeological sites and standing buildings which reflect the property's history. So while most of this property is used for agricultural reasons, the core area of the plantation is where all of the heritage resources are located. Within the historic district, of course, is the Kentland farmhouse, and that's sort of the core of the plantation. If we look into the larger region, up to the north is Brush Mountain, and the Kentland property is bounded on the south side, on the bottom of the slide, by the New River. Nestled in between the New River and Brush Mountain is the Wake Forest community, and as I said, many of the people at Wake Forest were descendants from the enslaved community that worked and lived at Kentland. So they play a very vital part in this story. Their history is a history of Kentland, and Kentland's history is their history. Now let's take a quick look at the historic district. It's outlined in the black lines here. And we have really three main things you'll see when you come out to the property. When you first arrive at the property, you see these cultivated lowlands next to the river that are in crop production. You'll see the adjacent hillsides that are used for livestock grazing and orchards. But as you keep driving along, you'll come to a group of agricultural buildings which are still being used for agricultural purposes, and they sort of give you the idea that this property has been used for agricultural purposes ever since about the mid-1700s, so for quite a long time. As you keep going, you come to the Kentland house, the centerpiece of the plantation, and another prominent feature on the landscape is the smaller feature, but it's still prominent nonetheless, and that's the Cowan cemetery. We'll take a quick look at some of these resources now. And this is the Kentland house, and as soon as you see that style of this architecture, you realize it's an old house. And indeed, it was built about 1834, and of course built by James Randall and Mary Cloyd Kent. Now, one of the things you really don't realize when you take a look at these slides or when you visit this property is that this house really embodies the labor of the slaves who were living at Kentland. Now, the Kents did hire a local builder to sort of design and build this building, and he had a group of artisans working with him. But under their direction, it was the slaves who went into the woods, cut the lumber for this house, dug the clay, molded it and burned it into bricks, went into Brush Mountain, cut the limestone blocks that formed the foundation from the house, and then under the direction of the builder, they helped put this house together. So one of the underlying currents here that visitors don't realize is that when you see this house and it evokes thoughts of the Kent family and the Kent's prosperity in the plantation system, one thing we don't always come to realize is that it was really the labor of the slaves that really made much of this possible. Not to take anything away from James Randall Kent, he was a very good businessman. There's absolutely no question about that. The agricultural buildings are still in use. The very large building on the right-hand side of the slide is an original building from the plantation system. It's a magnificent barn, and it's still used today by Virginia Tech to store their farm machinery. The second largest building, sort of in the center of the slide, is an old granary, and that also dates to the plantation itself. The smaller structure on the left-hand side goes to about the 1930s when this property was still operating as a farm, and that was a little machine shop. And also, of course, we have some modern features like this grain elevator and silo. But the main barn is still quite magnificent. It's still used today, as you can see. It's got a new roof, some new siding, but it is an original building. Some of the other buildings on that were for the agricultural purposes are no longer standing, and some newer buildings have been built. But this also, when you come here and you see these buildings, you realize that they're still used for agriculture. They evoke this, this long history of agriculture on the property. But one thing we have to realize is that the people who spent most of their time here, the people who generally occupied these buildings more than anyone else, were this enslaved community at Kentland. Another feature on the landscape is the Kent Cowan Cemetery. And it's surrounded by this limestone enclosure, and it's made conspicuous on the landscape because of this very monumental architecture. And so when you go out there, you sort of see the wealth and the power of the Kent family, and it's quite a nice feature. Also, underlying this message is the enslaved community, because it was their artisans who cut the blocks of limestone from Brush Mountain and laid this wall and formed the wall around the cemetery. So no matter where you go on the Kentland property, you are surrounded by an environment built by the enslaved community under the direction of James Randall Kent. Now, there were a lot of slaves, and that's really one of the main topics of tonight's presentation. And this chart here sort of gives you an idea of how, through time, the Kents really acquired a huge plantation system. And it's readily apparent that you can see that through the years there was a continual increase in the number of slaves. This reflects their increased wealth, their increased power. One of the things I put on this slide is the column on the right-hand side, because when we think of slavery, we don't always realize that over 1/3 of the population were young children. We tend to look at the figure of the number of slaves, and for some reason in our mind we automatically think they're adults. But actually a good proportion of the population were young children. This is not unusual, because in any agrarian society, people had lots of families. If you own a farm, it's advantageous to have lots of children, because those children grow and they're the labor force on your family. So, that was an important thing. Another thing is that in the 19th century, mortality rates, especially for children, were very different than they are today. Children tended to die at a young age, so parents would have more children. The generalization we usually hear is that if a child could reach the age of 8 or 10, they had a good chance of reaching adulthood. But most children tended to die before then. So that accounts for why we have a large population of children in the enslaved community. I'm sure that James Randall Kent encouraged his slaves to have as many children as possible. The more slaves, who reached adulthood, the more slaves he had to work his plantation. Two things I also wanted to talk about here, and while this slide is up, but if you look at secondary sources, if you look at histories of Kentland or histories of Montgomery County, you'll often see the number of slaves represented in these secondary sources. All of the information comes right out of the census manuscripts. The figures I'm showing you here, especially for 1840, 1850, and 1860, are much higher than what most people cite as the slave holdings of the Kent family. And there's a reason for this. Part of Kentland, and the Kentland that was inherited by James Randall and Mary Cloyd Kent, was 1,630 acres on the north side of the New River in Montgomery County. And Kentland that we know today, owned by Virginia Tech, is on the north side of the river in Montgomery County. But there was a period of time around 1840 to 1850 when the Kents purchased land on the south side of the river, which is in Pulaski County. They increased their land holdings, increased the size of their plantation. So if you go to the 1850 census manuscripts, you go to Montgomery County, you'll see the Kents listed, and you'll see a breakdown for the number of slaves on their property. If you go then to the Pulaski County census, you'll see James Randall Kent listed again, and another set of slaves. Now, some of these slaves could have been living on the Montgomery County side, some living on on the Pulaski side. I don't know. It's very possible that when the census enumerator visited the property, there were people on one side of the river, people on the other side. So he said, well, these folks are in Montgomery County, those are in Pulaski. It really doesn't matter because regardless, James Randall could move these people back and forth across the river, and so they could work all of his property at any time. So he actually had a large number of slaves. Typically for 1850, the number we usually see is 122 or 123 slaves, but he actually had some others that were acquired when he bought this land on the other side of the river. Another thing to keep in mind is the eldest daughter was Elizabeth Cloyd Kent. She never married. She was born at Kentland. She spent her whole life there. And during her life, she worked with her mother to run the household. In the 1850s, when her mother fell ill, and then when her mother died in 1858, she ran the household. And I also believe that during this time, she worked with her father and learned how to run the plantation system with her father, so that by the time he was reaching an older part of his life, she was playing a big hand in the operation of the plantation. And I say this for a couple reasons. And one big reason is that when she was younger and her grandfather passed away, she inherited a farm on the south side of the New River in Pulaski County, directly across from Kentland. And it was about 300 and some acres, and she owned 80 slaves working that property. So when we really think about the Kent household, we have to think about the land holdings, the wealth, and the slave holdings of James Randall Kent and his wife Mary Cloyd Kent, but also their eldest daughter, Elizabeth Cloyd Kent. So actually for 1850 and 1860, the Kent household had over 240 slaves, by far the largest slaveholding family in Southwest Virginia. And this really comes very close to some of the large plantations we see in the Piedmont and in the coastal area of Virginia. So this was a huge enterprise. There's no question that the Kents were very shrewd business people, and they knew what they were doing. Okay. Now, we learned about the cemetery here mostly due to the oral history, oral tradition of the Wake Forest community. This is a copy of a map drafted by Jimmy Price after he interviewed the descendant of a former slave, Mr. Bannister. And Jimmy managed to videotape his interview with Frank Bannister just a few months before Mr. Bannister passed away. And that's when Jimmy first learned about the cemetery. And then he and Mr. Bannister went out to the property and actually walked to the cemetery. Mr. Bannister said, here's where it was. So this is how we learned about this. You know, the enslaved communities, no matter if they're here or in a coastal plain, their histories were very poorly documented in traditional court records. So it's the way we learn about these people is through their oral tradition. And the Wake Forest community has a very rich oral tradition, which they've shared with us. We've also learned about the cemetery by talking to some other people. And we talked with Mr. Oscar Sherman. He passed away almost 2 years ago, and his grandparents were slaves. His brother's here today. And Mr. Sherman also pointed out the location of the cemetery, the same hill. Mr. Alex Jones, who now lives in Detroit, Michigan, also took us to the same hill and pointed out the cemetery. He learned about the cemetery from his grandparents, who were slaves at Kentland, and from his fathers. And I guess we also learned it from one other person, Mr. Oak Shepherd. Mr. Shepherd is not a descendant from the enslaved community, but he lived on the Kentland Plantation, and he has a memory going back to the 1940s when he was 8 years old and he was mowing grass around the cemetery. So he also gave us the same location of the cemetery on this hill. So let's take a quick review. We had the Kentland House, the core of the plantation, the Kent Cowan Cemetery, the agricultural buildings. This is the built environment we see at Kentland today. And then based on our oral histories, the slave cemetery. I did say we had 4 oral histories of the cemetery. They all pointed to the same hill. A slight change, 2 people thought it was located here, 2 people here. And so In 2004, we did some archaeological investigations in this area to check both of these areas and see if we had burials in both places, if it was a large cemetery, or in one place. And so in the autumn of 2004, we put 4 trenches there, 2 in the southern part of the hill, 2 in the northern part of the hill. This slide is facing south towards the New River. In the background, you can see those little white specks. Those are the buildings at the Radford Army Ammunition Base. So the trenches 3 and 4, located in the north part of the hill, actually turned up no evidence for graves. Actually, those trenches just produced really good evidence that this was an agricultural field. It had a nice plow zone on top of it. Underneath the plow zone were plow scars underneath, but no evidence for any burials. In the southern part of this area, we did find evidence for human graves. And it's structured right in this area, right where the orange circle is. Yellow circle, excuse me. Our methods for investigation are really quite simple. The College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, the college farm, gave us the use of a backhoe and a very able operator, Chad Keith. And we marked trench locations on the ground, painted here, and we used this machine to strip the top soil from the trenches. And I really like using machines on archaeological sites because they save a tremendous amount of labor, but you have to be very careful with them and monitor the work very closely because they remove a lot of dirt very quickly and you don't want any kind of accident to happen. So we monitored Mr. Keith very carefully as he stripped these trenches, and then as soon as the trenches were excavated, we covered them with black plastic in order to retain the soil moisture. When the soil is moist, it's very easy to see changes in soil color and to also recognize changes in the soil texture. And looking for graves and recognizing graves is really nothing more than seeing changes in the soil color and changes in soil texture. So we tried to keep the ground very moist. And the methods were pretty simple. Following excavation of the trenches by the machine, we did the more laborious work of smoothing the bottom of the trenches with flat shovels and hand trowels. Worked on this with students from Radford University in the anthropology program under Cliff Boyd, and also some of the Virginia Tech students studying under Sam Cooke. And it was pretty simple. You smoothed out the bottom of the trenches all the time, looking at the soils there and looking for a change in the soil colors. Once we see a change in the soil color, we investigate it to determine if it's natural or cultural. If it's cultural, it could be a grave. In the upper right-hand slide, you can actually see the bottom of the trench, and you can see that darker stain in the trench. That is one of the graves. When we found graves, then we documented the graves by taking photographs of them and making scale drawings. And then we drew a map, showing the orientation of all the graves in relation to one another. At no time did we dig down into the grave shaft at all. Instead, all we did was uncover the top of the grave shaft. If you went out to this property right now, out to this hillside, and you took a shovel and you dug a hole, and then you looked at the side of your hole, you would see that you had dug through 3 different types of soil. There's a topsoil, a very thin layer, right underneath the grass, and it's a very dark brown color. Underneath that is a second layer of soil, a little thicker, the subsoil, and it's lighter in color. It's a yellow-brown. Even deeper than that is a third layer of soil, and it's reddish in color. It has a lot of cobbles in it. Also, it has a very heavy content of clay, very different types of soil. And so when people went out to this property and they dug grave shafts, they dug down through these 3 layers of soil, piled the dirt on the side, then the deceased were placed in the grave, burial ceremony was conducted, and then then the dirt was backfilled into the grave shaft. During the process of digging out this dirt and then putting it back into the grave shaft, the 3 different types of soils, the 3 different colors of soils get mixed together inside the grave shaft. So the net result is that you have these rectangular soil discolorations in the ground that are where the soils are mixed or mottled together. So when we ran over this area and dug our trenches, We would dig down into the topsoil. Most of our trenches were about 8 to 14 inches deep. Sometimes they went a little bit deeper, but we would dig down into the subsoil, and so we would clear off this yellow-brown soil and then look in that yellow-brown soil for the darker stains. It's a very simple method, and it's a nice method in that it's non-intrusive. It doesn't disturb any of the human remains. It only uncovers grave shafts. Even though we didn't actually uncover the human remains, we still could learn some interesting things about the cemetery by looking at what we did find. And for one thing, almost all of the graves are oriented in the east-west direction. And this follows Christian tradition in which grave shafts are oriented west-east. The dead are placed in the graves on their back with the heads to the west, feet to the east, so that on Judgment Day, the Creator rises in the eastern sky to pass judgment on everybody. And depending on your particular religious beliefs, at that time, the dead rise either figuratively or literally from the grave to face their Creator and receive their judgment. And this is a tradition that carried over from Europe and was found in Jamestown and was pervasive in Christian cemeteries throughout up until about the mid-1900s. And then from there, the pattern started to change. But all of these graves are oriented with a celestial alignment, indicating that the enslaved people at Kentland were Christians, and they were, introduced to the Christian religion by the Kents, and they practiced this religion. Another thing is that if we look at the grave shafts themselves, we can sort of break them down into groups based on size. And we can make some assumptions on the size of these grave shafts. The larger grave shafts are about 3 to 3.5 feet in width and 5.5 to 6 feet deep. Those grave shafts, we assume, based on their size, are the grave shafts for adults. There were other sets of grave shafts that were much smaller. They were like 1.5 feet or 2 feet wide, maybe 2.5 feet long. Those were the grave shafts for infants. In between was a range of other smaller sizes that we think were used for young adults or for older children. Now, I know that's an assumption, but based on that assumption, the grave shafts that we encounter during our work here really break down to signifying 18 adults, 3 children, 2 infants. That pattern, goes very clearly with the slide we showed earlier, where approximately or just over 1/3 of the enslaved population were children. I actually expected more children or infant burials here because infants tended to die sooner, but that wasn't really the case. And of course, we only looked at a very small part of the cemetery. We did not uncover the entire cemetery. So even though we didn't actually look at all of the cemetery itself, when we didn't actually excavate into the human remains, there's still a lot of important historical information that we learned from this work. I did say that when we found a grave shaft, we documented it with photographs and scale drawings. Now, this is an example of our drawings. On the left-hand side are actually 2 drawings. On the bottom side is the drawing of the bottom of our trench. If you were looking straight down on the bottom of the trench, and there's 2 lines running in a diagonal which signify a grave shaft. Above that is a drawing of the wall or the side of our trench and the soil discoloration in the trench wall. And in that one, the top layer, number 1, is the topsoil. Number 2 is the subsoil, the yellow-brown colors, and the number 3s are the actual grave shaft. So each grave was documented in this way so we could get exact measurements. On the right-hand side is what our 2 trenches looked like during our first season of excavation in 2004. We put in 2 small trenches, found grave shafts in there, and then we could verify that the slave cemetery was located in the southern part of the hill. After this work was done, we met with the Wake Forest community. They came out to the site to see the results, and they held a prayer service there. And it was a very moving and emotional time because it was really the first time many of these people were connected with direct evidence of their ancestors that they grew up learning about. And so it was a very important time which transcended the archaeology and history, and it really connected to a more spiritual level. That was in a very important part. During the ensuing couple months, we held a number of meetings to discuss what we found and where we could go from there. And we conveyed all this information with the administrators at Virginia Tech. And one thing is that we did go through the first part of this project and meet with success. We verified the location of the cemetery. But where do we go from there? Some people raised the idea that maybe what we should do is try to determine the exact boundaries of the cemetery and locate all of the graves in the cemetery so they could be marked. And that would be a great measure to really help Virginia Tech protect this cemetery into the future, knowing its exact boundaries. On the other hand, that project would really involve a tremendous amount of work. We would have to remove all of the topsoil from this hill, move it off the hill, scrape this down, document the graves, and backfill the dirt and recontour the landscape. And looking at it, I think the majority of the people in the Wake Forest community, the majority of the Kentland Revitalization Committee, and even the Tech administrators all thought that that was a bit intrusive. It was a little bit too large. So we talked about other possibilities, and what we decided to do is take a middle ground and conduct more work at the cemetery so that we can make an informed estimate of the size of the site boundaries. Not actually documenting the boundaries exactly, but we get a real good idea of the size of the cemetery. Another thing we decided to do is take this opportunity to answer questions people had regarding the cemetery. On one hand, the eastern side of the cemetery faces a real steep slope, so the break in the land where you start the slope is a good way of determining the boundary of the cemetery because people didn't bury their dead on steep slopes. But on the other side, on the western side, there's a more gentle slope. And people looked at that area and thought, there could be graves out there. So we really had to do two things in our second season of work, is test some of these areas where people thought there might be graves, determine whether or not there are graves there, and then try to focus on our core area of the cemetery to gain some informed information on the boundaries of the cemetery. So this past season, in September and October and into November, we did more work there. And this is our plan map showing all of our trenches. And as you can sort of see, the graves really do cluster in one small area. Over to the left-hand side where the ground sort of gently slopes, no graves there. And actually, when I looked at aerial photographs of this property that date from like 1929 to 1974, it indicates that this area was an agricultural field. And there was a fence line running north-south between the cemetery itself and the agricultural field. And the cemetery really just shows up as a clump of trees. So at one time there were a number of trees growing on it. If you go up to the cemetery today, it's nothing but a grassy knoll. It's used for hay cultivation. You don't see any headstones. You don't see any depressions for graves at all. So, really it's just a grassy field. This is a sort of a blow-up or close-up view of our trenches, and it shows all of the graves that we found within these trenches. And I think we have, looking at this information, comparing it with the oral histories from the Wake Forest community, the aerial photographs, and then using the topography and the lay of the land, I think we have real good evidence for determining the size of the cemetery. And I feel that the cemetery is about 75 feet by 150 feet in size. And we talked with Virginia Tech about this, and then by all means they're going to protect this cemetery, and they've decided it would be advantageous even to put an extra 25 to 30 foot boundary or buffer all the way around this. And what we're going to do is, this is on state land, and Tech is going to protect the cemetery, but state lands can be sold. So there's no guarantee that this land will be part of Virginia Tech's land holdings 300 years from now. So the important thing is to document this cemetery and mark its location so that if the land should change hands, it can be protected. New personnel come into the college farm to run it. They'll be able to look at our documentation and know exactly where the cemetery is and its size, so they can, continue to protect it. And so we have the slave cemetery here. One of the other things we talked about with the Wake Forest community after our first field season was, not only maybe doing some more work, but more importantly, we needed to do something to honor the people who were buried in the cemetery, to memorialize their lives, and to affix something onto the landscape so that when visitors come to the property, they can see something and actually have a visual reminder of the enslaved community. And like the people in this picture, the people buried in the cemetery, we don't know their names. We don't know anything about their life history, the days they went through, the people they loved, the people they were married to, their day-to-day lives. This picture was taken at Kentland sometime probably in the late 1800s or early 1900s. And these were household servants there. And so the Wake Forest community, with the assistance of the Kentland Revitalization Committee, received a grant from the Friends of the New River. And they used that grant money to purchase this marker. And the McCoy Funeral Home provided the marker at cost and set the stone in the ground at no charge. And in April of 2005, the Kentland community held a public service to dedicate this marker, also to memorialize the lives of the people buried in the cemetery. The marker was placed in an area immediately east of the cemetery. So the cemetery is just on the top of the hill where you see the cross. And actually it's sort of between the cross and that utility pole right up there. And so now we have actually a structure on the landscape to recognize the people who lived and worked at Kentland. And it's a very important part of our history and their history. So now we can honor and remember their lives, their part in the history of Kentland, their part in Montgomery County's history, in state history, and their important contribution to our national history. And it also brought about a nice communion where these people at Wake Forest were able to actually connect with their ancestors on this property. Virginia Tech has been wonderful throughout this whole property, and we have a dialogue going with the Virginia Tech administrators, and they're willing to do anything as a final treatment for the cemetery that the Wake Forest community should want, and they respect Wake Forest's decision on this, and it should be the decision of the Wake Forest community. So if they want a fence put up there, the College Farm put up a fence. If you want unobtrusive markers, those will put up there. Nonetheless, they're willing to do whatever they want. The marker area itself is going to be landscaped and sort of transformed into an area for prayer and meditation, and it'll be marked from the main road, so visitors at Kentland will now have this visual reminder of the enslaved people who once lived and died on this property. And that brings about sort of a conclusion, but at the very end I have some acknowledgments to make of the partners who worked on this project. Now, these are only a few people of the Wake Forest community. It's my understanding the Wake Forest community signed a petition requesting that Virginia Tech allow this project to be undertaken, and about 60 people signed the petition. The people we see listed here were really the movers and shakers in the community, the people who really organized the rest of the community, attended the meetings, and really provided the guidance for this entire project. And then we have the Kentland Revitalization Committee and also the administrators from the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences who provided help with this project. And that's about the end of my presentation.